Hi, so welcome to First Chapter Friday. This is the March 5th edition, and today we are going to be reading the first chapter of Ickabog by J.K. Rowling. First chapter 1, King Fred the Fearless. Once upon a time there was a tiny country called Cornucopia, which had been ruled for centuries by a long line of fair-haired kings. The king at the time of which I write was called King Fred the Fearless. He announced the fearless bit himself on the morning of his coronation, partly because it sounded nice with Fred, but also because he'd once managed to catch and kill a wasp all by himself, if you didn't count 5 footmen and a boot boy. King Fred the Fearless came to the throne on a huge wave of popularity. He had lovely yellow curls, a fine sweeping mustache, and looked magnificent in the tight breeches, velvet doublets, and ruffled shirts that rich men wore at the time. Fred was said to be generous, smiled, and waved whenever anyone caught sight of him, and looked awfully handsome in the portraits that were distributed throughout the kingdom to be hung in town halls. The people of Cornucopia were most happy with their new king, and many thought he'd end up being even better at the job than his father, Richard the Righteous, whose teeth, though nobody had liked to mention it at the time, or rather crooked. King Fred was secretly relieved to find out how easy it was to rule Cornucopia. In fact, the country seemed to run itself. Nearly everybody had lots of food, the merchants made pots of gold, and Fred's advisors took care of any little problem that arose. All that was left for Fred to do was beam at his subjects whenever he went out in the carriage and go hunting 5 times a week with his 2 best friends, Lord Spittleworth and Lord Flapoon. Spittleworth and Flapoon had large estates of their own in the country, but they found it much cheaper and more amusing to live at the palace with the king, eating his food, hunting his stags, and making sure that the king didn't get too fond of any of the beautiful ladies at court. They had no wish to see Fred married, because a queen might spoil all their fun. For a time, Fred had seemed to rather like Lady Eslanda, who was as dark and beautiful as Fred was fair and handsome. But Spittleworth had persuaded Fred that she was far too serious and bookish for the country to love her as a queen. Fred didn't know that Lord Spittleworth had a grudge against Lady Eslanda. He'd once asked her to marry him, but she turned him down. Lord Spittleworth was very thin, cunning, and clever. His friend Flapoon was ruddy-faced and so enormous that it required 6 men to heave him onto a massive chestnut horse. Though not as clever as Spittleworth, Flapoon was still far sharper than a king. Both lords were expert at flattery and pretending to be astonished by how good Fred was at everything from riding to tiddlywinks. If Spittleworth had a particular talent, it was persuading the king to do things that suited Spittleworth, and if Flapoon had a gift, it was for convincing the king that nobody on earth was as loyal to the king as his 2 best friends. Fred thought Spittleworth and Flapoon were jolly good chaps. They urged him to hold fancy parties, elaborate picnics, and sumptuous banquets because Cornucopia was famous far beyond its borders for its food. Each of its city was known for a different kind, and each was the very best in the world. And this is the first picture in the book. King Fred the Fearless came to the throne on a huge wave of popularity. And this was drawn by Sarah, age 11. The capital of Cornucopia, Clarksville, lay on the south of the country and was surrounded by acres of orchards, fields of shimmering gold wheat, and emerald green grass on which pure white dairy cows grazed. The cream, flour, and fruit produced by the farmers here was even given to the exceptional bakers of Chalksville, who made pastries. Think, if you please, of the most delicious cake or cookie you've ever tasted. Well, let me tell you, they'd have been downright ashamed to serve that in Clarksville. Unless a grown man's eyes filled with tears of pleasure as he bit into Clarksville's pastry, it was deemed a failure and never made again. The bakery windows of Clarksville were piled high with delicacies such as maidens' dreams and fairy cradles, and most famous of all, hopes of heaven, which were so exquisitely, painfully delicious that they were saved for special occasions, and everybody cried for joy as they ate them. King Porphyrio of neighboring Plutonia had already sent King Fred a letter offering him the choice of any of his daughter's hands in marriage in exchange for a lifetime supply of hopes of heaven. But Spittleworth had advised Fred to laugh in the Plutonian ambassador's face. His daughters were nowhere near pretty enough to be exchanged for hopes of heaven, sire, said Spittleworth. To the north of Chalksville lay the green fields and clear sparkling rivers, where jet-black cows and happy pink pigs were raised. These in turn served the twin cities of Curdsburg and Barrontown, which were separated from each other by an arching stone bridge over the main river of Cornucopia. The Fluma, where brightly colored barges bore goods from one end of the kingdom to another. Curdsburg was famous for its cheeses. Huge white wheels, dense orange cannonballs, big crumbly blue vined barrels, and little baby cream cheeses smoother than velvet. Barronstown was celebrated for its smoked and honey-roasted hams, its sides of bacon, its spicy sausages, and its melting beefsteaks, and its venison pies. The savory fumes rising from the chimneys of the red brick Barronstown stove mingled with the odorous tang wafting from the doorways of the Curdsburg cheesemongers. And for 40 miles all around it, it was impossible not to salivate breathing into the delicious air. A few hours north of Curdsburg and Barronstown, you came upon acres of vineyards, bearing grapes as large as eggs, each of them ripe and sweet and juicy. Journey onward for the rest of the day, and you reach the granite city of Jeroboam, famous for its wines. They said of the Jeroboam air that you can get tipsy simply walking in its streets. The best vintages changed hands for thousands upon thousands of gold coins, and the Jeroboam wine merchants were some of the richest men in the kingdom. But a little north of Jeroboam, a strange thing happened. It was as though the magical rich land of Cornucopia had exhausted itself by producing the best grass, best fruit, and the best wheat in the world. Right at the northern tip came the place known as marshlands, and the only thing that grew there were some tasteless, rubbery mushrooms and thin, dry grass, only good enough to feed a few mangy sheep. The marshlanders who tended the sheep didn't have the sleek, well-grounded, well-dressed appearance of the citizens of Jeroboam, Barronstown, Curdsburg, or Chalksville. They were gaunt and ragged. Their poorly nourished sheep never fetched very good prices, either in Cornucopia or abroad. So very few marshlanders ever got to taste the delights of the Cornucopian wine, cheese, beef, or pastries. The most common dish of marshlands was a greasy mutton broth made of those sheep who were too old to sell. The rest of Cornucopia found the marshlanders an odd bunch. An odd bunch of surly, dirty, and ill-tempered. They had rough voices, which the other Cornucopians intimidated, making them sound like hoarse old sheep. Jokes were made about their manners and their simplicity. As far as the rest of Cornucopia was concerned, the only memorable thing that had ever happened out of the marshlands was the legend of Ickabog. And that's the first chapter of J.K. Rowling's Ickabog. Enjoy, and let me know if you'd like me to get you a copy.